Welcome to the DNA of Things, where we explore the stories behind the science and the questions that move us from data to meaning. Today's guest is Dr. Yael Joffe, a pioneer in the world of nutrigenomics and someone whose story begins not in a lab or at a whiteboard, but at her grandmother's bedside. That's where the question started. Why did this happen? And it's that question that guided Yael through a career defined not by speed or by scale, but by something much more rare: integrity. In a world where genetic testing can be flashy, commodified, and even misleading, Yael has insisted on something deeper, a framework that values precision over prediction, people over platforms, and education over evangelism. So what you're about to hear is not a sales pitch, it's a seeker's story. Someone who chose to ask better questions, even when the answers were slow, complex, or even unpopular. Let's dive in. Dr. Yael Joffe is a pioneering figure in the field of nutrigenomics, blending her background as a clinical dietitian with decades of genetic science. She co-developed the world's first lifestyle genetics test in 2000. Well before the human genome was mapped, and as the founder and chief science officer of 3x4 Genetics and founder of Manuka Science, she's been instrumental in bridging the gap between complex genetic data and practical personalized health strategies. With a PhD from the University of Cape Town and academic posts at Rutgers and the Maryland University of Integrated Health, Dr. Joffe is a respected educator and global voice in the field, a relaxed academic. Ooh, I like that. I borrow that. And a passionate open water swimmer. She brings warmth and voice in the field, to the field. And her story, rooted in South Africa and now thriving in Seattle, is one of quiet persistence, visionary science, and a deep commitment to empowerment and empowering people through DNA. Dr. Yael Joffe, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for the intro, and great to be here.
You know, we were just talking at the top of the call. We were introduced through, I just kept hearing your name come up through, mutual contacts, great people who I respect. Not least among them is Stuart McMillan, I believe CEO of Baltas, who some might have seen him recently on the Huberman podcast, introducing skipping and making skipping fashionable again as a safer substitute to sprinting. Yeah, again, maybe for the first time, at least for adults. So yeah, you're doing great things. I read about your partnership with Nutrigenomics, another great organization committed to health, longevity, health span. So I felt compelled to reach out, and I'm certainly glad that I did. And you've been at this since the early 2000s. That I did not know, and so I'd really love to learn how somebody in the dietetics world comes into genetics and says, "Wait a minute, I don't know what it's like in South Africa, but in Canada, it's like, here's a food guide, and if you do this, you're good. That's all you need." So how would you go from that kind of paradigm to like, wait a minute, we have individual needs, and I think I can do something about that? Because that seems like a bit of an inversion, at least in my experience, working with dietitians from 25 years ago. So how'd you get started?
Yeah, you're right. And my story goes back actually one more degree behind that. And that kind of explains a little bit more, is that I was actually studying architecture and had no interest in nutrition, science, genetics, medicine, but none. I was into art and design and architecture. And while I was studying architecture, my gran died from cancer, and I was very, very close to my gran. And I was just horrified that there were no answers. The doctors were awful, actually. They could not tell me why she got cancer. They could not help her when she had cancer. They could not tell me how to prevent cancer. So I was really significantly impacted by her death, and sat by her deathbed and said, Gran, I think I've got to leave this architecture thing and kind of go and figure out how we could have prevented this cancer from, devastating your life and ultimately losing your life. And so I literally left my grand's bedside, went to architecture department, resigned from architecture, left, and then kind of went on this mission of how do I find answers? And that was not easy in the 1990s, where I had this concept, I'm going to study health. I'm going to study health and I'm going to figure out how not to get cancer and why get cancer and treat cancer. And of course, there wasn't a degree in health. Things are a little bit better now than they were such a long time ago. And the only degree I could find was dietetics, the one that kind of felt the closest to health. So I signed up to study dietetics, which is kind of interesting because I didn't do science in my last couple of years at school. So I had a lot of catch up to do. And I was like 3 weeks into dietetics, literally. And I was just, again, horrified when the lecturer was like, this patient's really sick in hospital. We're going to give them chocolate cake and ice cream. And I'm like, what? I was reading the Optimum Nutrition Bible and I was reading macrobiotics like on my own time. And it just didn't make sense that you would give a sick patient, chocolate cake and ice cream. And when I asked why, they were like, oh, it's got protein, it's got carbohydrates. And I was like, no, this is a disaster. I just left the degree. I kind of moved across the country. I signed up for this dream to study health. And here I am in chocolate cake and ice cream. So again, like huge disappointment. And I had to make a decision what to do. So I decided to finish my degree. So like 3, 4, 5 years later, still like hating it. But I wanted the degree. So I got the degree and I also didn't know what else to do. And there wasn't anything in dietetics at the time that I thought was valuable. I know it's a very harsh comment to say about dietetics, but to your point, the food pyramid, the plate, and, but it just was a really poor experience for me. And so when I finished it, I was like, okay, now I still need to go find the answers because I actually don't have any. I didn't get any answers. And one thing about living in South Africa is whenever you kind of finish your degree and you want to travel, you have to go work in London for a couple of years to earn some foreign currency to go travel Europe. So I left and I went and got a job in London and I worked at like a clinic in Harley Street. Now, Harley Street is kind of where the cutting edge clinics in London are. And while I was working in this clinic, just trying to save money, not because I wanted to be a dietitian or work as a dietitian to save some money, this extraordinary woman walked in, Dr. Rosin Gilgarrison, and she was a geneticist, a molecular biologist. And she was like, I'm looking for a dietitian who specializes in genetics. I'm starting the first ever company in the world building a nutrigenomics test. And I was the only dietitian at the clinic. And I was like, that sounds interesting. I have no idea what you just said, but there's something about it that sounds really interesting. Kind of put my hand up and I was like, I know nothing about genetics, but I'll learn. Anyway, long story short, I landed up joining her and I was like the first employee. She literally was building the first ever company. And I kind of learned, textbook, what is a gene? What is a SNP? What is a chromosome? But there was something about it that just made me believe that the answers that I was looking for, I would find in this amazing world of what we call nutrigenomics, nutrition genetics, into what had happened to my gran. And of course, I spent like 4 years with the first company ever you mentioned. We built the first test in 2000. I joined them. I moved to Boulder, Colorado with them. And then I realized like 4 years in, like I still don't know anything. I was the dietitian. They were the geneticist. I wanted to do what they were doing. They were doing the cool stuff. I was just doing, nutrition. So I went back to university and that's when I got the PhD and that was in nutrigenomics. And even that experience, there was no supervisor for me. Like there were no supervisors in a PhD in nutrigenomics. So kind of had to piece together. So anyway, that's the story of how I landed up in this amazing world of nutrigenomics so early. And it explains kind of a lot about my career is that I actually didn't come from science. And, your comments about the relaxed or reluctant academic is I actually came from a more social science, art kind of background.
See, I knew there was a reason why we were fast friends. And it's great to uncover that on this conversation where I can share, let's say, my interest in health originally triggered by my mother's own illness, multiple sclerosis. Before that, I was very much interested in, more of a creative career. So much more interested as an author. as design, drawing, much more musical. Never really pursued any of those passions, I suppose, because I guess kind of this question came out of when I learned about the diagnosis. Mom comes home, 5 kids. Hey, I have multiple sclerosis. Don't worry, it's not genetic, and it's a progressive kind. So it's like this deterioration back then was imminent, and so it was like it's not DNA, or it could be your environment. And so you're like, what does that even mean? Like, how does this whole human body thing work? And fast forward, even going into studying university, there wasn't a program for that specifically. So what I did do was molecular biology, biochemistry. Of course, I gravitated that kind of art component that I guess got more of like a heart aspect of my, call it STEMs, like science, technology, engineering, math, right? There's still a kind of heart call. I was always interested in the people that made the discoveries and the thinkers. And I was called to a very philosophical supervisor that, pulled me into this realm of metagenomics, which is like the DNA of everything. And fast forward a little further, I did take on a role of professor in the capacity of nutrigenomics in a very, let's say, traditional school of nutrition where science, while it was a core competency in the degree, it didn't seem to be the focus. It was more food security or food insecurity and food policy and food accessibility. All of those things are critical, right? It's like survival health first. Population health seems to be the paradigm that's guiding these like kind of general recommendations because, but first things first, let's make sure there's enough food and then everybody is alive. But like you, one of the books that I was using or looking at, made perhaps wrong in more of a kind of a clinical application or precision health application. This was back when I was 14. It was like this, do you remember Dr. Barry Sears's The Zone?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So as this 14, 15-year-old kid running around talking about cosinoid balance and, the email wasn't a thing back then. So I was writing letters but it was like, then you learn you're like, oh, I'm doing this fringe science because I don't know how to do research. Well, it's not fringe. It's actually frontier. Right. And we see that, or we saw that a lot. We're still seeing it unfold in the US as it relates to, public health and the NIH. And how do you balance those two paradigms of, population health and precision health? Because, not all healthy food is good for everybody. And in fact, healthy food can be quite toxic to some. And so, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but is that kind of what you started to see in nutrigenomics? What was it after you got the PhD and now you're back? And then is that where 3x4 genomics comes in? When does that come into the scene? And
so I'll just say, it is, so it's 3x4, not 3x4. That's okay. Everyone says it like that. So I always say ex-boyfriend, 3x4. So actually 3x4 really came much later in my career. There was a long, long journey of learning and discovery and challenges. And I call it the dark night of my genetic soul and all kinds of things that happened before 3x4. That allowed me to be able to build something like that. Because as you know, because you're deeply in this field like me, the journey of genetics in the last 25 years has been super tough and not great. And so, I would say like the first 15 years, we really went down, and I use the we as a collective we, as in the field of genetics and the genetic marketplace really lost its way. In the early 2000s, but human genome was kind of launched. Like we were dreamers, we believed that genetics would solve everything, that having this knowledge of the genome would really give us insight and solve everything and that we knew about health and disease. And it didn't end up being that. In fact, it landed up being a lot worse than that. And, in about 2014, I was just feeling I was always involved in building genetic tests for kind of startups. And I just was like, wow, we've done a shitty job, and I have a few comments on that I'm happy to share about why I think we did a shitty job. Is that okay? Can I share my thoughts on that?
Please, but can you answer this one burning question for me?
Yeah.
3x4 genomics. Why can't I figure out where the name came from?
Okay. Can we save that question? I do want to answer it, but it'll explain itself a little bit more once I give you the context of why I built 3x4. Then I'll explain to you.
I love the suspense. Let's go.
Okay, so So here's why I think the genetic testing marketplace, or genetics per se, lost its way. So two things happened. So when I started in Sona, which is the first company, we tested 13 SNPs. That was pretty good in the year 2000. And it was like $250 or $300 or whatever it was. And then what happened with the Human Genome Project and, what happens with technology as it scales is we were able to test more, a lot more, right? We had these amazing chips from like Illumina and Thermo Fisher, and we could test a lot, like let's test 10,000 SNPs, let's test 100,000 SNPs. And what happened was kind of two things happened. The one is data happened. So the world became data crazy, and we're still in this kind of data space, where if we can test it, we should test it. And look how clever we are, because we can accumulate so much data. And this is kind of the biohacking space, and a lot of companies out in the marketplace whose job it is to kind of test you in 100 different ways and gather as much data about you as possible. So we get very excited about data, and we think that if we have a lot of data, we're successful. I would kind of challenge that. Anyway, the other side of it, so that's when we did that, we just flooded the kind of genetic space and said, well, we can have data, but the data can have no value. And that's what actually happened is we were testing like crazy, but didn't know what to do with the data to tell you what you should eat for breakfast or why this is happening to you or what you can do better. So it was a data space. The other side is we saw all these companies pop up that were testing single genes. So when I say single genes, I mean, I'm only going to test ApoE. I'm only going to test MTHFR. And then based on that one SNP or that one gene, I'm going to give you diet recommendations. I'm going to give supplement recommendations. And I'm going to tell you that if you have ApoE, you're going to get Alzheimer's. So we got into this kind of single gene craziness, and it was very driven by the supplement industry. So what would happen is you would test MTHFR, and then you would get 17 different supplements with methylated B vitamins. And when you took that, it would make you more ill because it was over-methylating you. And then you would take more supplements, which they would sell you. So the supplement industry drove this kind of single SNP, and the kind of testing industry drove this data. And the thing that was missing from all of this was, what is useful to me? Who am I? And what is useful to me? Yeah. And we completely lost our way.
Yeah.
And in the middle of that happening, health professionals did not understand this at all. And no one was teaching clinicians how to use genetics, how to understand it, how to appreciate that you can't have one gene and give a whole lot of supplements. So clinicians or health professionals or health industry were not academics, were not taking ownership of this and saying, this is not okay. You can't give 20 supplements for a SNP. This is one way to do it. So there was just this mess, really. And that's kind of where I found myself in about 2014, 2015.
I can wholeheartedly relate. That was around the time that I started Athletigen, 2014, 2015. And here's the thing. I had come from, I had just finished my tenure as a professor. So I did about 2 years, and then I got recruited into industry where I was working for a longevity and fertility company. And they were essentially, they had selectively bred these mice for about a decade, and they were able to double reproductive lifespan of these mice, if you can imagine. It'd be like humans having babies until they're, 100, let's say, or 80, 90. So my job as the CTO was to come in and look at all of the data, transcriptomics, genomics from, all these different tissue samples. And lo and behold, we learned and discovered new variants associated with longevity and reproductive performance. And, the whole idea was, how do you package this insight potentially as a nutrigenomic first pass to the customer on their way to in vitro fertilization, let's say? Or at least that was my angle. Their thinking was, how do we take this data from mouse models and apply it to the dairy the cattle industry, dairy industry?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right? Because the Holstein cow has been selectively bred for milk volume, right? Okay. and it's basically half its reproductive lifespan. So if we could just take, this array of, let's just say there were thousands of potential markers, and apply this to breeding practices in the dairy industry, then, well, maybe you could reverse this trend. Now, of course, you talk about the industry driving things, right? It's like, well, all those people that own all that bull sperm that they paid a lot of money for are not gonna let go of that. And so what? You're only going to modify half of the equation? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. And this was my first experience working in a company. So the CEO recruited me, said it was going to be this amazing company, and then within like 3 months of me coming on, he resigned and took a safe government job. I was like, wait a minute. So then I got to view the board meeting, and who was the board? Who was on the board? Well, it's a bunch of investors, and who were they? They were a bunch of kind of angry dairy farmers, being like, "Where's this open? Where's my money?" Right? So you talk about drivers. The main thing that's driving it, well, I suppose in the end would be food supply, wouldn't it? But that's not actually. That would be the argument. Yeah, but the industry drivers are not that. So anyway, I got a taste of this, and I was like, this was a whole new paradigm. That's why, I commented on the relaxed academic or recovering academic. I just thought, wow, what a fascinating world. And you see, the thing is, all through my PhD and even my postdoc, when I went to Cornell, I called myself a pseudo athlete. That was my connection with Altus, right? It's like, how long as long as I'm an academic, I'm going to be an athlete also, right? And so I had passion in athletics and sprinting, track and field, and although it's a low contact, no contact sport, injuries are rampant, particularly with sprinters, right? And so I was a walking bag of injury and at the end of my career, obviously. But then I thought, gosh, if I could, combine these two, passions, let's say, of athletics and genetics, what good might I do? How might that help? And, so I started my first project was I got a bunch of graduate students and, all these things that are being done with AI now. And we scoured the literature, and we created a panel of around 100 markers associated with athletic performance. Of course, most of this is correlation, very little causation, with, details that we can go into or not. But the point was, we had this panel of around 100 markers, and we actually learned some pretty amazing things. Like, for example, high performance athletes have an overrepresentation of injury protective alleles. Not a surprise, but then it's like, well, how do you action that? It's like, well, maybe better programs in training programs and development programs in youth, right? But then like some things made sense. Well, why are these athletes? Why are they always sore? Why are they always on the massage table, right? So I was like, oh wow, this is actually really potentially powerful. But you see, the market wasn't huge, and the science was only preliminary. And so then what you're getting this push of investors be like, well, no, do like 23andMe and make it more accessible and make it more mass market ready. And I'm just like, personally, I was like, that's not why I started this. And that was maybe wrong of me. There was a little bit of my kind of residual academic curiosity meets accountable founder who took people's money, and you have to do things, right? So that's a whole conversation that might actually do well as our jumping off point to talk about the recent events, to the extent that you'd like, with respect to 23andMe, right? Is like the stakeholder pull, right? Like, how do you, as a founder, as a CEO, how do you operate with integrity, right? And that's a very personal question, and it's not meant to be, like, if we're going to talk about 23, it's not meant to be a personal attack on Anne. I think we both agreed that she was able to do some pretty amazing things, and in both, in the words you said, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your reaction to that, what was your reaction on the news of the chapter 11 that we heard?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's no surprise. I mean, you and I have been watching this for a long time. And so when the news came last week that they were 23andMe was filing for bankruptcy, none of us were surprised, because we've been watching this play out for the last couple of years. And it's interesting because my current CEO, who's also invested in our company, told me 3 years ago that 23andMe will cease to exist. And I was like, you're crazy. That's never going to happen. Like, 23andMe has been part of, actually 23andMe launched 2006, I think it was. And actually, so I was actually pre-23andMe, but it was such a big part of our world, and so I never believed there would be a world in genetics where 23andMe didn't exist. They changed the conversation around genetics. They brought it to the table. They brought it to families. They made it, dinner party conversation, and no other company, even though there are other companies that have actually done more testing than 23andMe, no other company changed the conversation on genetics. So actually watching what's happened in the last couple of years has been quite unbelievable. And then when we heard about the bankruptcy filing last week, I had this deep sadness, that we were coming to the end of an era, and this world without 23andMe, was actually happening. And what would, for me, a lot of it was like a sadness. I think she actually, it's very easy for us to say they made some bad decisions. I think at the time, they probably weren't bad decisions. I think if they'd found something in drug discovery, it would have been a completely different conversation. Fact is, they didn't. They went into a very high risk, high return, scary place. But I think it's a good time for reflection on what are the things that they could have done better. What are the opportunities for us to do better? And, to go back, when you're in the world of startups and industry and building companies, you're always tackling this integrity of, am I going to sell supplements? And then I always say, we'll never sell supplements as long as I'm in this company. Are we going to sell data? We'll never sell data. So for me, it's always been part of my journey of the things that I wouldn't do and the things that I would do. And, I find myself now in 2025, 3x4, where I've been very lucky to be able to make decisions around the company that fit very strongly with my moral compass around supplements, not selling them, around not selling data. And always, I feel like a little bit of the David and Goliath, where the Goliath was 23andMe. And here we are kind of growing slowly but steadily, but, being able to be in a kind of a safe space.
Yeah. Okay. So 3x4. So I'm itching to know the name.
Okay, the name. All right. I'm still not going to tell you. No, okay. Let me tell you why I built 3x4. And then it'll explain what the name means. All right. So I built an education company. You mentioned that, Manuka Science, because clinicians weren't being taught this at universities. I was like, well, if they're not going to teach it, I'm going to teach it. So I built an education company, online training in what we call translational nutrigenomics. How do I actually use this genetic stuff with my patient? Then I built a clinic because I was like, what if the stuff I'm teaching doesn't work? Often we teach, but we actually don't know how it plays out. So I built a clinic. It was called the Center for Translational Genomics, where every single patient had to have a genetic test. And we used the genetics with our patients, and we said and we used the teaching from the course. Anyway, and that went really, really well. And when I built my teaching company, I knew that until we worked out a model to take genetics and make it really easy to use with our patients, it would never be successful. Because one of the challenges of genetics, if a doctor is spending 2 to 3 hours interpreting genetic results before they see their patient, we're never going to have any mainstream success, because what doctor or anyone has 2 to 3 hours to review a result? So I came up with a model. At the time, it was called the 333 model. And the idea was, how do you review genetics in such a way that at the end of the day, you can tell me what are the 3 most important areas I should focus on in my health? Is it detox, inflammation, glucose, insulin, histamine, hormones, whatever it is? But what are the 3 most impacted areas when my genes are having the greatest impact? What are the 3 most important diet things I can do? Not 10, not 20, not 50, but 3. What are the 3 most important lifestyle things I should do? And what are the 3 most important supplements I should take? Not 10, not 20, but 3. And so that's 3, 3, 3, 3, which is 3x4. So that was my teaching model. And then when I built the company, which was essentially building a genetic test to help clinicians use this or individuals understand this in a really simple way, it was very much based on this idea of 3, which was 3. So that's how the name of the company came. So you couldn't have guessed that.
Well, once you started explaining it, you were giving it away. So, but yeah, clever. Well, I like that because it actually maintains a connection to, well, the environment, right? And the nature, nurture kind of side.
Yes.
And then of course it lends itself to advances in research as well, because, the 3 things that are important today are going to be based on everything that we know and information that we have access to and in the context of you. But of course, as we gather more information and we get better context, those things might change, but they'll likely change less often because it seems to me you've got a powerful heuristic that's based on first principles. So unless we're changing the full paradigm of first principles, this shouldn't change too drastically. And because it's not based on a single marker, it won't upset the whole system.
Correct. And it's based on biochemistry. So the one thing I learned, so in addition to starting in this amazing world of genetics in 2000, I was also introduced to functional medicine. And I've been in functional medicine for 26 years now, and functional medicine is all about root cause analysis. Like, if I'm having these symptoms, where did they come from? What was the dysfunction that happened in my body that manifested what we say downstream as a symptom? Is it a migraine? Is it obesity? Is it brain fog? What is the dysfunction? And then going back. And so when I built 3x4, I had a very different lens because I was thinking about not what is the genetics of diabetes or what is the genetics of heart disease. Lots of companies doing that. I wasn't interested in, do you have a predisposition to diabetes? I was like, that's not particularly useful for you. I want to know why is something happening in your body that may manifest as diabetes or as dysregulated glucose downstream. And so everything in functional medicine is kind of around biochemistry or biochemistry not working in the way we want it to work. And so when I built 3x4, it was very much based on what are these metabolic or biochemical or physiological, whatever word you want to use, pathways that are happening in our body. How are genes impacting them? And then how do we go back upstream and say, what are the most important things to focus on? And so these are kind of core principles. They're not like fashionable genetics. They're not like, this is the trend for the moment. This is kind of core basics of biochemistry, which has been taught forever and a day. And I think because of that, we always evolve in our science. We're always reviewing the literature. We're always adding new genes in. But the core principle of it kind of is very much based on those very simple ideas of what is happening in your body, how are the genes impacting it. And that's been a really big help for us in that it's not like a trendy version of genetics, if that makes sense.
It does. And, as you're speaking and, both of us having been in this space for so long and you think about one of the big products at least in the consumer genetics world has been this kind of ancestry report. I mean, 23andMe, I don't think they went there by choice. I think they went there. Well, they went there by necessity because the FDA basically said, you can't do this, right? You can't give people any insight. This is back in 2013,
I think it was.
Yeah, you're right. Because I was actually working on believe it or not, a partnership with them looking at the relationship between high performers and TBE. So so that was put on hold because of the FDA ruling. And so then Ancestry became a product and we know that Ancestry DNA does this as well to deepen the, connections of their members. But the really interesting thing is, so first of all, like to address your insight on the biochemistry and looking at the human as the whole human, right? And not to make it mechanical, but let's just say a system and systems biology. Mm-hmm. But then there's, the interface with the environment. So where you happen to find yourself. And then there's the behavioral components, right? Some of those things might be taught. Some of those might be, call it pre-programmed as per epigenetics. But it's really fascinating to consider it through that lens, especially with emerging, technologies like AI. You knew I was going to go there. But the thing that I'm interested in is the kind of the natural history of the genome itself, right? So when you start to look at functional medicine, root cause medicine. So let's say you take, my stepmother, she's from China. Let's say you take my friend George, he's an Aboriginal Canadian. And then let's say, my friend Nick is Eastern European, right? And let's just say they're in their evolved, adapted environments, right? And let's consider their isolation pre kind of gene flow days. Let's imagine geographical and cultural barriers making these folks different. So the instance of, take my friend George with the Aboriginal Canadian genetics being thrown into agrarian culture, being exposed to, tens of thousands of years of agriculture byproducts. Well, now all of a sudden they develop type 2 diabetes very quickly because they had a fasted famine type of cycle. Take my stepmother, May, she comes over from China and she sees the billboards, got milk, it's a superfood, and she's, boom, hit with explosive diarrhea, right? Because she's lactose intolerant, she doesn't have the lactase persistence gene, right? And you take my good friend Nick, the Eastern European, well, he can eat carbohydrates because nobody's business, right? So, and there's let's just say he has the right balance of copy number variation of salivary amylase, right? But each of those individuals set in their system, their environment being part of the system, their culture, their behaviors being part of the system. I mean, it's fascinating that they've found that equilibrium. But now you've got this cosmopolitan tendency, everybody everywhere all at once, and the cultural barriers are breaking down. So you've got a cosmopolitan type genome. To me, that's very fascinating. When I looked at that through like an athletic lens, what I found was particular variants that are at higher frequency at different populations would show up in me. So I would say something like, well, I have the injury predisposition of a Southeast Asian because I had the kinds of SNPs that made collagen that seemed to be more prevalent over there. And I had I eat like a Mediterranean because like apparently like the zone diet was good for me. And then I have let's say I train like a North African, right? And at the end of the day, how did this transform me is like, well, if I get my training plan just right, I'm okay. But if I try to do something that my friends are doing or eat how they eat, it can look like I have a monster truck engine with a Chevette chassis and I'm throwing in jet fuel and everything just breaks. You know what I mean? So I went very mechanical there, but I thought the fascinating thing is how dynamic the natures of our genomes are is really what I would pull it back to. And so as much as we may look the same, there's a lot going on beneath the surface. And so what has it been like to give people access to that insight?
Well, it's been wonderful. I mean, I've never heard anyone quite describe it the way you did. I mean, it's an interesting way to talk about it because, I mean, what you're saying is these genes have got a high frequency in these populations, but actually we all have access to those SNPs and how we respond to different things. I always say like people forget, genetics is evolutionary biology,
Yeah.
And I'm actually giving a presentation at A4M next month. And I normally do like the genetics of hormone metabolism or genetics in women's health or genetics in sports, and I was like, you know what? Maybe we just need to go back to basics and talk about this concept of evolution and genetics, because that's essentially what genetics is. It's evolutionary. And I think what's happened, and the reason why I felt so strongly about giving this presentation is there's this idea in the world that there are good and bad genes or good and bad SNPs.
Yeah.
And even in the way you kind of describe it, it's like, well, if I can't handle lactose, it's bad. And if I can handle it, it's good. I mean, you didn't say that, but I'm just saying a lot of people will like do that if I can't, Anyway, so I was like, we've become very binary, as we do in most things in this world, about genetics, that there's good and bad, SNPs. And actually, that's really not true. I mean, obviously in the medical genetic space, it absolutely is true. But in the world of nutrigenomics, it's not as true, because everything we have in our genome that is in the space of diet, lifestyle, environment, stress, trauma, exercise is evolutionary. And we'll always have like a risk-benefit game happening that in some time in your life, it might be beneficial. In another time, it might have some more kind of deleterious effects. It might, protect you against malaria, but kind of increase your risk for Alzheimer's, whatever it may be. And so we've kind of lost this idea of actually what genetics is information and helps us to adapt to our environment. So in the case of your friends and your stepmom, like what is genetics to them? It's information to help them in their adaptation to a new environment, because adaptation, evolution happens over a very long time, right? Not in the 10 years that you moved to the US, it happens in a long time, but it also enables you to be able to make decisions in the environment that you're in to optimize your health and well-being, emotional well-being in that space. So for me, why do I love genetics? Because I always describe it as our genes tell us who we are and how we respond to the world around us. And every single person should have access to that. Know who you are and know how you respond to the world around you. Now, how I respond living in Seattle is different from how I respond living in China or how I respond living in Africa. So if I know who I am and how these genes are changing that response, I can adapt my environment, my choices, my training, my nutrition. So, for me, this is so empowering for an individual, because it doesn't mean that, you're not a victim of your environment. You can absolutely create a better place for yourself. When I moved to Seattle, I'll give you a great example. I come from South Africa and the sun always shines. Sun always shines. Well, 9 months of the year, the sun shines, and 3 months it's winter. Of course, I moved to Seattle and it's the flip, 9 months winter, 3 months sun. And genetics and epigenetics, you mentioned epigenetics, should never be seen apart from each other, right? Yep. Because genes tell us our blueprint, who we are, and epigenetics is how does our environment and our diet and our lifestyle and everything change our way our genes express. And I never, when I started on genetics, I didn't understand that very well. Then I started really to understand it, because something like weather can change gene expression. So when you're in a cold, miserable, gray, dark environment, it's switching on or switching off genes in a way that make you feel a certain way. For me, not a great way. For my son, he thrives in Seattle weather. When we had COVID and we were isolated, disconnected, and lonely, that changes gene expression and resulted in a lot of things. So it's just this whole world is all about our genes and who we are, but also how the choices we're making in the world, where we live, who we hug, who we eat with, what we eat, what we watch on TV is going to change gene expression. And for me, why wouldn't we want to have this information to kind of curate the best possible life? So that's a very long answer to why I love doing the work we do.
Well, and how it's empowered people. And to your point, just to pull on that thread further is, so on the one hand, with like the athletes, for example, we're talking about no good genes, no bad genes, just context, right? Moving aside, obviously, some things like rare disease or diagnostic insights. And so something like, for example, the sprint gene, right? It's like, wouldn't you believe it? Wouldn't you expect that? I was delighted to see that among my very first clients, customers, if you will, and I can say this because she said I could, she was a sprinter who went to the Olympics who didn't have the sprint gene. And there have been other documented cases. So it's like, well, basically what you're saying is people who are trained in this way for these events, these sprint events, have this sprint gene kind of thing, right? But it's like, well, is there another way to sprint? And in the same way, it's like, well, all these athletes, well, they have 70% plus of elite athletes had overrepresentation of protective alleles. So it's like, should we select athletes early on based on protective alleles? Like, well, we could become gardeners as coaches instead of drill sergeants and throwing eggs at the wall. We could get creative about, trying to, understand how to bring that performance out, honoring the fact that we have different bodies. And then coming back to something you said about the supplement industry as well, positioning milk, they don't do that anymore, but as a superfood, it's like, well, superfood for who?
Yeah, superfood.
Right. So yeah, it really does, change the conversation to one that I think is scalable, right? And this is one of the things we talked about at the beginning, which was, population health versus precision health. And, obviously that's got to be an incremental way forward. But I mean, I think I'm going to guess that you think similarly to me, and you can say no, that I expect in a hopeful future, data privacy, security, honoring, let's call it the sacredness of an individual's DNA for reasons, how you just described DNA, who we are and how we might become, et cetera. Let's assume that all those best practices are in place. I mean, let's not assume, but let's live in that world just for a moment, right? I mean, I imagine a future where everybody has access to their whole genome, and that is, and then again, we're looking at data in a different way because we can handle more data more quickly again, in theory, imagine the hopeful future for me, right? I know there's all kinds of unintended benefit or unintended consequences potentially. I think you and I are more familiar to those than most. And so to that end, the ability to analyze tremendous amounts of data, the genome, the epigenome, proteome, microbiome, all of that stuff, I think is really exciting. But I do think one thing is very important that you called out at the very beginning, which is that the person is at the center of that, right?
Yep.
Like all this data is like super, like as the kind of, as captured as I was in the world of academia and the technical possibility of something, I think is amazing. But then the practicability of it and the humanization of it is like, oh, this information is important to know because this child is suffering with a symptom that I've never seen before, right? And with something like rare disease, as an example, while rare disease exists, byproduct in part due to, an additional layer of, well, let's call it survival in our genomes. And that's, the fact that random mutation is important to provide the variation for natural selection to do its thing on, right? Because our environments aren't static, at least not yet. And so the idea that there are rare disease is not surprising, but actually the number of people who are at least carriers of a rare disease, I would venture to say is probably, people would say the 300, million individuals diagnosed. Well, how many are undiagnosed? I would say it's more like a billion. How many are carriers? I'd venture to go out and say almost everybody's a carrier, right? And so the question is, well, how does a rare disease manifest? It comes back to that combination of things that you're talking about, right? The mutation, the environment, behavior in some instances. Some are more deleterious than others, effectively. But there is an interesting moment here where you can get that information, to parents with a newborn, or to your point, there are, some of these pathologies are stage dependent later, right? But the way you're analyzing your genome developmentally, for a health span initiative, for sport, whatever, like how is the agency, because this I think comes back to the education. So it's no accident you are here where you are. How does the education become, part, and the empowerment become part of it? Because not everybody has a PhD in molecular biology, right? So that's one thing that I see as a problem where you hear about 23andMe and a lot of the conversation now is, well, wait a minute. So the minimum bid for 23andMe right now is, let's say, 300 million. That covers all the liabilities. So does that mean that 50 million people's DNA is worth 300 million? Do they get that? Do buyers get that? So that's a very interesting question. Where's the individual agency on that? And if I'm amongst those 15 million, do I download that and use it? Am I compelled to ask for that and have it be on my local computer? And are we running LLMs on our private devices? Is that the future? But then if we have this privacy, do we lose intimacy? So how are we sharing, right? So I think the future is, I think it's going to require dialogue. And that was in essence the reason for starting this, is like the more people from different backgrounds who can weigh in and we can have a conversation in a way that, again, you don't need a PhD in genetics to understand. And hopefully we're hitting on the first principles. But yeah, I mean, what's your position on, well, 3x4's role to play? Because there's a gravity now, there's a void, I should say. And you probably feel some degree of responsibility to step up. And well, I know you do. And I wonder how you're handling that and what you're thinking and what you're feeling and what's the hopeful future that we can help you get to?
Well, it's interesting because the one thing about 3x4 that we've been very careful about is we say we stay in our swimming lane. And what I mean by that is when I founded the company, I am interested in two spaces. The one is what we call this translational genetics, which is what difference does it make to me when I wake up in the morning? What am I going to eat? What am I going to drink? What am I going to do? So we are very focused on that personal empowerment of choice. The choices you have to make. I would say every second of every minute of every day, you're making choices. And the amazing thing is you get to change that choice like every other second. And that choice should be informed by understanding your genetics. So this is the space, there's two spaces we work in. That's the one. The other one is we have another brand called GeneFit Pro, which is sports genetics. And we have a whole team, right? Sports geneticists, exercise scientists, coaches, sports and conditioning. So you were kind of very early in the space. We were lucky that we weren't early, and we were able to kind of step into this very exciting space of sports genetics and how it's going to change not only professional sports teams we work with a lot, but also myself. I call myself a committed recreational athlete. The choices I'm making, managing my training, preventing injury, making sure I'm recovering from training. And those are the spaces that we play in. Now, 23andMe played in a lot of spaces, right? They built the company on Ancestry because it was the way to get the greatest amount of data, because it's an easy sell, right? Ancestry is an easy sell, and they could get it. They needed data. They were always a data company. They were never a clinical company or a translation company. They sold a health report, and there's a lot of things I disagree in what they offered. But essentially, they wanted data, and they made a decision to use this data for drug discovery by selling the data. So one of the reasons why I say this is because now they're talking about what is the value of the company to sell, which is really just to cover the liabilities, and they're selling the data. But actually, they've sold the data already, because they sold it to GlaxoSmithKline for $600 million. And they actually sold everyone's depersonalized, so it doesn't have your Gmail address and doesn't have your phone number and it doesn't have your name. They've already kind of sold that data once before. So it's an interesting thing of like, what is the value now when the data's already been sold and it's just data? So I personally, and of course it's easy for me to say, feel like there's an inevitability that all of us will do a genetic test in some time in our life. And for different reasons, whether it's ancestry or health or disease prevention or longevity, sport, drugs, what is the best medication for me to take? We're all heading to a time in human medicine and health where we will all do a genetic test. So the most important thing is to find a company that reflects what you want to get out of it. What is the answer you're looking for? Because if it's training for an Ironman, or if it's preventing cancer, or if it's deciding whether you should take warfarin or not, like there is going to be companies that are going to fulfill that, and the individual is going to have to make those choices. And so where we are in 3x4 is we have always had some kind of principles. The one is we don't sell supplements. We never recommend a supplement brand. We don't work with any particular supplement and say, you need to take this. And that has been a kind of a line for me in the sand. And the other thing is we don't sell data. So it was never our business model to say, we're going to test 20 million people, and then we've got an asset or IP that we can sell. So we're a different kind of company. And absolutely, 23andMe not being around is definitely a vacuum in the space. And we would love to step in and work in that space of health and disease prevention and longevity and sport and everything. But we're never going to be a 23andMe. We're not going to do ancestry. We're not going to do pharmacogenomics. We're not going to do medical genetics. I think we will always stay in that swimming lane, but we want to do the best job we can in that swimming lane. And that means keeping those kind of ethical parameters or those kind of guardrails in place. And that means education, both for the consumer and for clinicians. So we still continue to be the kind of gold standard for teaching clinicians genetics. It's going to be about always, making sure that we're on top of the science. It's going to be about how do we engage with it. It's going to be about privacy and security and how data is saved and how data is shared. And so it's an interesting, time for us, but actually doesn't change anything that we do. I think we're going to see some other companies step in. I think, look, Ancestry.com is bigger than 23andMe and Ancestry. They've sold more Ancestry tests than 23andMe. 23andMe does a lot more marketing. And they played in some very dynamic spaces, but actually Ancestry sold more tests, and they will continue to own Ancestry. I have no doubt if they can, because they haven't done anything like drug discovery things. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens now, because I think some people are feeling anxious about their 23andMe data. But I think this is a new beginning for genetics where we can learn from the past and kind of step into how we do things better in the future. And hopefully we'll be in there.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said for the wisdom of your words, because Ancestry DNA, for example, or Ancestry.com, like Ancestry DNA was sold to, well, the product of DNA Insights was sold to an existing
Correct.
thriving business where people, what were they going to Ancestry.com for? Well, they wanted to understand their family origins, their roots, and their connect. They were going there for connection, right? They were going there to understand where they came from, to organize these family trees, and then actually pass this insight on as kind of legacy to their children, their grandchildren. I mean, you would have actually the most technically savvy 60, 70-year-olds on Ancestry DNA, literally spending 20, 30 hours a week and building these family trees. Yeah. And then you hit a dead end, and then you throw in DNA, and then all of a sudden it opens up more connections. And that's what people went to Ancestry DNA for, is for the need and the demand and the, I guess, some sense of identity as well that they were looking for with Ancestry.com. And so probably it was a big reason why when Ancestry Health launched, it wasn't successful. It was like, well, the people who are here, they do want health information, but they don't want it here. They
don't want it here.
No, I don't want to buy my vegetables at the butcher. So I think there is that, and I just don't think the customers weren't educated for that kind of an insight, and yeah, regardless as to whether or not they were looking for it. I mean, they were, but just not there.
Not there. Yeah.
So
I agree.
Yeah, I mean it's a very important thing that folks hear your words of wisdom, right? It does come back to helping the customer solve the problem, and I think in my years in industry, which aren't as many as yours, so I might be speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but the kind of the paradigm that I've come back to is it's what is it? You travel the world and you come back and you know yourself for the first time. Is that T.S. Eliot? Am I getting that right? Is that wrong? Regardless,
Yeah.
You come back and it's like, well, how does this help my mom turn away, rest her soul, not with us anymore, but turn away from that chronic disease, which now we know is avoidable with better information, or at least more manageable.
More manageable, yeah.
Right. And so, and I think that's the voice calling out in the wild, right? Is who are these folks in pain, right? And if we think we do our jobs right, the product is, well, I think it's awesome people doing awesome things, right? And maybe it's like, no matter what your product is, in a way, it's in service of that, and you don't own that person, you don't own their data, et cetera. But it would get like, hey, tell me what I did that worked for you so I can do it with more people. So we could be co-creators in a better service.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where the more I look at products, the more I look like there's no product. It's a product in service of something, right? So, well, I mean, I just thank you for this incredible dialogue and insight. I mean, it helped me, kind of get to that aha. And so if you remember from the beginning of our call, I said I was going to hit you with 3 questions at the end, right? So now that we've gone through and had the dialogue, is, gosh, what is the key insight here that we are, passing on to listeners, the audience, and who in the audience do you think needs to hear it?
So I think that what I would kind of share is that, I believe that every individual, and including those who at the moment who don't have access to genetics, gains great value in knowing their genetic profile as one of the greatest, most powerful ways to empower themselves to live their best life in context of the world that they live in. And I know it sounds a bit cliche, maybe a bit trite, but it really does give them that. And there's very few other things that can give you that kind of empowerment. So this is the world I dream about. We always want technology to be cheaper. We want access to be greater, but I think we'll get there. And I think that every individual will find, I always say, every individual finds a gem. They find a gem in their genetics and enables them to live their best life. So I think that's the future that I see in the world of genetics. And I think we're getting closer.
Mm-hmm. So your message then is to everybody.
Everybody.
Okay.
Everybody.
And the last question is, who would you nominate as my next guest?
So I think it's worth speaking to Dr. Christine Horton. She is in Brisbane, Australia, and she is probably one of the smartest people I know. She's a co-author of mine, and I always say we like the yin and yang of Nutrigenomics. And she's brilliant in the world of how did the things that we do and the foods we eat change the way our genes express themselves. So I'm more on the genetic side, and she's more on kind of expression. And she's quite brilliant. Amazing. She would be my nomination.
All right. Well, I will chase her down. Before then and next time, where is the best place for people to find you?
Well, 3x4genetics.com is the website. info@3x4genetics.com if you want to ask any questions. Yael at 3x4genetics.com, or obviously all the social media, it's just Yael Joffe.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I will put all that information in the show notes until I publish. Dr. Yael Joffe, thank you so much for the insight and commitment to the industry that started from a very soft place in your heart so many years ago. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so that was Dr. Yael Joffe, founder, scientist, teacher, and maybe most importantly, question asker. There's a line from the episode that stuck with me where Yael says, if we don't get the science right, people get hurt. And that's really what this conversation was about, not just genetics, but responsibility, not just knowledge, but wisdom. If you'd like to go deeper, I've written a companion piece on my Substack, DNA of Things. Please check it out. It pulls together some of the bigger themes we touched on, legacy, ethics, and what it means to practice science with a backbone. You'll find the article in the show notes, along with links to Yael's work and the 3x4 platform. Thanks for listening to the DNA of Things. Until next time, keep asking beautiful questions.